War has always raised terrible questions. Who can be attacked? What weapons may be used? And how do we protect people who are not fighting? International Humanitarian Law, or IHL, gives us answers. It limits the effects of armed conflict, protects civilians and prisoners, and restricts methods of warfare. Clients, journalists, or students may ask lawyers, what is the Geneva Convention? Can civilians be targeted? Who is responsible for war crimes? In this lesson, we will explore the Geneva Conventions, the key principles of international humanitarian law, and how courts prosecute violations. We'll also practice modal verbs, must not, cannot, and may, to explain obligations and prohibitions in clear legal English. By the end of this lesson, you will use vocabulary like humanitarian law, combatant, civilian, distinction, proportionality, war crimes, genocide, and international criminal court. You will understand the role of the Geneva Conventions and the types of armed conflicts. You will use modal verbs of obligation and prohibition to explain IHL rules. For example, civilians must not be targeted, medical staff must be protected, weapons that cause unnecessary suffering cannot be used. We'll apply legal phrases such as respect IHL, protect civilians, prosecute war crimes, and commit genocide. Imagine this, and it's not too difficult to imagine with what's going on in the world. Two countries are at war. In one town, enemy soldiers are hiding inside a school building. The building also hosts 200 civilians. The military commander asks, may we bomb this target? Under IHL, the commander must consider principles like distinction and proportionality. The school is normally a civilian object, but if it is used for military purposes, it may become a target. Yet, the commander must not cause excessive civilian deaths compared to the military advantage. This story shows how IHL uses both rules and judgment calls, and how lawyers explain these issues using precise English. International Humanitarian Law, or IHL, is sometimes called the law of armed conflict. It is a set of international rules that limit the effects of war for humanitarian reasons. This means that even in the middle of conflict, there are boundaries. Not everything is allowed. IHL has two main goals. First, to protect people who are not fighting, such as civilians, medical staff, and aid workers. And second, to restrict the use of certain weapons and methods of warfare that cause unnecessary suffering. For example, IHL protects civilians during war. This simple sentence expresses the heart of humanitarian law. Imagine a journalist asks a lawyer, is war completely lawless? The lawyer answers no. Even during war, IHL applies. Hospitals must be respected. Prisoners must be treated humanely. Weapons like chemical gas cannot be used. IHL balances the reality of armed conflict with the need to preserve humanity. Lawyers, diplomats, and judges use it constantly when analyzing military operations or humanitarian crises. The Geneva Conventions are the foundation of modern humanitarian law. They are international treaties that set clear standards for how wars must be fought and how people must be treated during conflicts. Every state in the world has signed and ratified them, which makes them truly universal. The first Geneva Convention was adopted in 1864, mainly to protect wounded soldiers and medical staff. After the horrors of World War II, The four Geneva Conventions of 1949 expanded these protections. They cover civilians, prisoners of war, the sick and wounded, and property like hospitals. Additional protocols in 1977 added further rules, although not all countries have ratified them. For example, every state has ratified the Geneva Conventions. Imagine someone asks, why are these treaties so important? And you can explain, because they're binding on every country. They are the backbone of IHL, and they set the minimum humanitarian standards that no government can ignore. In short, the Geneva Conventions are the world's promise to limit the cruelty of war. A combatant is a person who has the legal right to fight in an armed conflict. Usually, combatants are members of a country's armed forces, soldiers, pilots, or sailors, because they participate directly in hostilities. They may be lawfully targeted by the enemy. For example, combatants can be targeted in battle. This sentence shows the basic rule. Unlike civilians, combatants are not protected from attack. However, combatants also have rights under IHL. If they are captured in an international armed conflict, they must be treated as prisoners of wars, POWs. This means they cannot be punished simply for fighting as long as they followed the rules of war. Imagine a young law student asks, can a soldier be attacked while sleeping? The lawyer answers yes. Combatants can be targeted at any time, on duty or off duty, unless they are wounded, sick, or have surrendered. Understanding who counts as a combatant is essential because it helps distinguish legal targets from protected persons. A civilian is anyone who is not part of the armed forces and who is not directly taking part in hostilities. Civilians are the main group that IHL is designed to protect. For example, civilians must not be targeted under IHL. This simple rule is one of the most important foundations of humanitarian law. Civilians include children, teachers, farmers, journalists, shopkeepers, people who are living their normal lives in conflict zones. They must be respected and protected, no matter what side of the war they live on. However, civilians can lose their protection if they decide to participate directly in hostilities. For instance, if a farmer picks up a gun and joins a battle, he becomes a target for as long as he is fighting. And imagine a client asks, can the army attack a village because it supports rebels? The lawyer replies, no. Civilians cannot be attacked simply for their opinions or location. Only direct participation in hostilities changes their status. The principle of distinction is the cornerstone of IHL. It requires warring parties to always distinguish between combatants and civilians, and between military objectives and civilian objects. For example, the law of distinction protects homes, schools, and hospitals. This means that by default, everything is considered civilian property unless there is clear proof it is being used for military purposes. Military objectives include weapons, bases, tanks, or even buildings that are being used for military advantage. Civilian objects include houses, schools, farms, and hospitals. These must not be attacked unless they lose protection by being used militarily. For example, if a hospital is turned into a military base, let's imagine a drone operator sees enemy soldiers hiding in a school. The lawyer explains, normally, schools are protected civilian objects, but if the building is used as a base to launch attacks, it may become a military objective. Distinction forces decision makers to think carefully. Who is a legal target and what objects are protected. Without this rule, war would be total and unlimited. The principle of proportionality accepts that in war, civilians may sometimes be harmed unintentionally, but it sets limits. An attack is unlawful if the civilian harm is excessive compared to the concrete military advantage expected. For example, the bombing was illegal because it was disproportionate. Proportionality requires military leaders to weigh costs and benefits. How important is the target? How many civilians could be harmed? If the harm is too high, the attack must not be carried out. This rule is not always easy to apply because there is no mathematical formula. Different commanders or courts may disagree about what is proportionate. Let's imagine a commander wants to destroy one enemy truck parked in a busy market. A lawyer advises, no, the civilian deaths would far outweigh the military gain. In practice, proportionality combines legal, moral, and strategic thinking. It recognizes that civilian harm sometimes happens, but insists that it cannot be ignored or accepted without limits. This principle protects humanity in the middle of armed conflict. War crimes are the most serious violations of international humanitarian law. They include acts such as intentionally targeting civilians, torturing prisoners of war, attacking medical facilities, or using prohibited weapons. For example, killing prisoners is a war crime. War crimes are different from ordinary violations of IHL because they are considered grave breaches. And under the Geneva Conventions, all states are required to prosecute or extradite individuals responsible for war crimes. Imagine soldiers bomb a hospital even though they know it is full of civilians. And a lawyer explains, this is not just a mistake, it is a war crime. War crimes can be prosecuted in domestic courts, or if the state is unwilling, in international courts like the International Criminal Court, ICC. Commanders, soldiers, and even political leaders can all be held accountable. Understanding the term war crimes helps lawyers explain why certain acts in war are not just morally wrong, but also legally punishable at the highest level. Genocide is one of the gravest crimes in international law. It is defined as the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. The key element is intent, the deliberate plan to eliminate a group of people because of who they are. For example, the court convicted the leader of genocide. Genocide can involve mass killings, but it also includes acts such as preventing births, transferring children, or creating living conditions that will destroy the group. Imagine a tribunal hears evidence that an army systematically attacked villages belonging to one ethnic minority, killing people and burning homes. A lawyer explains these acts were not only war crimes, they were genocide because they aimed to eliminate the group itself. Genocide has been prosecuted in international courts, such as the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. It remains one of the most universally condemned crimes in human history. In international humanitarian law, obligation is expressed through the modal verb must. It signals a strong legal duty, something that is not optional. For example, civilians must be protected. Prisoners must receive medical care. All parties must respect IHL. These sentences do not describe a choice. They describe binding legal rules. Think of must as the language of law, treaties, and court decisions. When the Geneva Conventions say medical staff must be respected, It means there is a universal duty to protect them. For example, let's compare. Doctors must treat the wounded, a legal duty, or doctors should treat the wounded, which is advice and weaker. Let's look at a story. A military doctor asks, "Do I really have to treat enemy soldiers?" The lawyer replies, "Yes. Under IHL, you must treat all wounded without discrimination." Using must helps lawyers speak clearly about obligations in humanitarian law, leaving no doubt that these are binding duties. While must shows obligation, must not and cannot show prohibition. They describe what is forbidden in IHL. For example, weapons that cause unnecessary suffering must not be used. Civilians cannot be targeted. Prisoners must not be executed. Notice how absolute these rules are. They do not allow exceptions. Let's look at a story. A commander says, "What if we use chemical weapons just once to scare the enemy?" The lawyer answers no. Chemical weapons must not be used. They are banned under IHL. The prohibition is total. Compare. Civilians cannot be targeted, illegal prohibitions, to civilians should not be targeted, which is advice too weak for law. Cannot is often used in speech, while must not appears more often in formal legal writing. Both express a strict ban. For example, a young soldier asks, "Can we punish them by refusing food?" The officer replies, "No. Prisoners must not be starved. That is a war crime." Using must not and cannot allows you to explain humanitarian rules with clarity and authority. In addition to rules about obligation and prohibition, IHL also contains rules of permission. These are expressed with may or can. May is more formal and legal. It signals that something is permitted. Can is used more often in everyday speech to describe what is allowed. Let's look at some examples. Medical personnel may carry out their duties without interference. Combatants may be targeted in battle. Civilians can lose protection if they take part in hostilities. Notice the difference. Civilians must not be attacked, but combatants may be targeted. Doctors must be protected, but they may also cross battle lines to treat the wounded. Let's look at a story. Can we attack the enemy soldiers hiding in the forest? The lawyer answers yes. They are combatants, so they may be targeted. Understanding may and can helps explain what is lawful but not required under IHL. To respect IHL means to follow its rules in both letter and spirit. Respecting IHL is not only about governments. All parties to a conflict, including non-state groups, are bound by it. For example, all parties must respect IHL. Respecting IHL means soldiers must not target civilians. Commanders must review weapons to ensure they are lawful, and governments must incorporate the Geneva Conventions into their domestic law. Let's look at a story. A UN peacekeeper explains, even if one side violates the law, the other side must still respect IHL. Compliance cannot depend on reciprocity. Compare. The Army must respect IHL, obligation to follow rules. The Army should respect IHL. Sounds optional, but it is not. Imagine a rebel leader claims, "We don't recognize the Geneva Conventions." A lawyer responds, "That doesn't matter. All parties in armed conflict must respect IHL, regardless of whether they sign the treaties." Respect IHL is a phrase that emphasizes law as a minimum standard that applies in every conflict. To protect civilians means to actively safeguard people who are not directly taking part in fighting. It is one of the main purposes of IHL. For example, the Army has a duty to protect civilians. Protection is not only about avoiding attacks, it also means ensuring civilians have access to food, medicine, and shelter, that they are evacuated from dangerous areas when possible. For example, during a bombing campaign, a commander suggests targeting a city district. A lawyer advises, no, civilians live there. Our duty is to protect civilians, not place them at greater risk. Let's compare. Soldiers must not attack civilians, which is a prohibition, to soldiers must protect civilians, which is a positive duty to safeguard them. Imagine a client asks, if civilians hide in a combat zone, do they lose protection? The lawyer explains, no. Civilians remain protected unless they take up arms. The responsibility is on the military to protect them whenever possible. Protect civilians highlights IHL's humanitarian aim to keep war from becoming total destruction. To prosecute war crimes means to bring criminal charges against individuals who commit serious violations of IHL. Prosecution may take place in domestic courts, military courts, or international tribunals. For example, the court prosecuted generals for war crimes. War crimes include killing civilians, torturing prisoners, using prohibited weapons, or intentionally attacking hospitals. Under the Geneva Conventions, all states must prosecute or extradite people accused of war crimes. Let's look at a story. A journalist asks, what happens if a country refuses to try its own soldiers? A lawyer replies, if the state is unwilling or unable, international courts like the ICC may prosecute war crimes instead. And compare. The state may investigate war crimes, permission, or the state must prosecute war crimes, an obligation. Imagine a captured commander is accused of ordering executions. His trial is held in a national court. The prosecutor explains this case is about accountability. We must prosecute war crimes to uphold IHL. This phrase shows that violations of IHL are not just rules broken, but crimes punished by law. To commit genocide means to carry out deliberate acts intended to destroy a group of people because of their nationality, ethnicity, race, or religion. For example, the regime committed genocide against the minority group. Genocide, like we talked about before, can include mass killings, but also other actions, such as preventing births or transferring children away from their families, or creating living conditions designed to cause the group's destruction. Let's look at a story we've all heard about. In Rwanda in 1994, extremist leaders organized mass killings of the Tutsi population. A tribunal later ruled the regime committed genocide. The difference between genocide and other war crimes lies in the intent. Ordinary war crimes may violate IHL, but genocide involves a specific plan to eliminate a group. Let's compare. The army committed war crimes, serious violations, to the regime committed genocide, aimed at destroying a group entirely. You can imagine a law student asks, is genocide always during war? And the lawyer can answer, not necessarily. Genocide can happen during armed conflict or even in peacetime. Customary law is one of the two main sources of international humanitarian law. Unlike treaty law, which is written and signed by states, customary law develops from consistent practice by many countries, combined with the belief that such practice is legally required. For example, respect for civilians is part of customary international law. For instance, Even before a treaty banned the use of poison in war, many states had already stopped using it and agreed it was unacceptable. Over time, that widespread behavior and belief created a rule of customary law. Customary law is important because it applies to all states, even those that have not signed certain treaties. Imagine a lawyer explains, even if a country never ratified the additional protocol, many of its rules are binding as customary law, such as the rule of distinction. In simple terms, customary law is like an unwritten agreement of the international community. When enough states act in a certain way and believe it is legally required, the practice becomes binding. A prisoner of war, or POW, is a captured combatant who is entitled to special protection under IHL. For example, POWs must be treated humanely. Combatants who are taken by the enemy in an international armed conflict cannot be punished simply for fighting. They must be given food, shelter, and medical care, and cannot be tortured or executed. The idea is that soldiers fight for their country, not for personal reasons, so they cannot be criminalized just for being part of the war. And imagine, a young soldier asks, if we capture enemy troops, can we imprison them for life? Lawyer replies, no. You may detain them until the end of hostilities, but you must release them afterwards. The Third Geneva Convention deals specifically with the rights of POWs. Violating these protections, for example, killing or abusing POWs, is considered a war crime. POWs show how IHL balances military necessity with human dignity, even for those who were once on the battlefield. Crimes against humanity are some of the most serious violations of international law. They involve widespread or systematic attacks against civilian populations, whether during war or in peacetime. For example, ethnic cleansing was protected as a crime against humanity. These crimes include acts like murder, torture, sexual violence, enslavement, forced displacement, and apartheid. What makes them unique is that they are not isolated events. They are part of a larger plan or policy. Imagine a tribunal investigates a government accused of disappearing thousands of civilians. The lawyer explains this is not just a war crime, it is a crime against humanity because it was a systematic attack against civilians. Unlike war crimes, which must be linked to armed conflict, crimes against humanity can also occur outside traditional warfare. That makes them a broader category in international law. Understanding this term helps lawyers explain cases before international tribunals, such as the International Criminal Court, which prosecutes crimes against humanity as one of its core crimes. The International Criminal Court, or ICC, is the world's first permanent international court created to prosecute individuals for the most serious crimes: genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. It is based in The Hague, Netherlands, and was established by the Rome Statute in 2002. For example, the ICC prosecuted a leader for war crimes. The ICC acts as a court of last resort. It can only act if national courts are unwilling or unable to prosecute. For example, if a dictator is protected in his own country, the ICC may step in. And imagine a journalist asks, can the ICC prosecute any country? The lawyer explains, not exactly. Only states that ratified the Rome Statute are bound by it. However, the UN Security Council can refer cases even from non-member states. The ICC focuses on individual responsibility, not state responsibility. This means heads of state, generals, and other leaders can be put on trial. And by prosecuting top-level perpetrators, the ICC aims to provide justice, deter future crimes, and give victims a sense of accountability. Accountability in IHL means that individuals and states must answer for violations of humanitarian law. It reflects the principle that no one is above the law, even during war. For example, accountability for war crimes is essential for justice. Accountability can take many forms: criminal trials, truth commissions, reparations for victims, or sanctions against states. The goal is to ensure that serious violations like war crimes, genocide, or crimes against humanity are not ignored. Imagine, after a civil war, a peace agreement grants amnesty to commanders. A lawyer explains amnesty may help peace temporarily, but without accountability, victims lose trust in justice and violence may return. Compare. Without accountability, violations continue unchecked. With accountability, perpetrators know they will face consequences. Accountability also has a preventive function. When leaders know they may be prosecuted internationally, they may hesitate before committing atrocities. In short, accountability ensures that humanitarian law is not just words on paper, but a system that demands justice. Let's bring everything together with one full case scenario. Government forces discover that rebels are storing weapons inside a factory. The factory is next to a large neighborhood with 5,000 civilians. The commander asks his legal advisor, "Can we bomb the factory tonight?" The lawyer replies, "Under IHL, you must first apply the principle of distinction. The factory may be a military objective because it is storing weapons, but the houses, schools, and hospital nearby are civilian objects and must be protected." The commander insists, "But the attack could weaken the rebels." The lawyer responds, "Yes, but you must also apply proportionality. The civilian harm cannot be excessive compared to the military advantage. If hundreds of civilians die for the sake of destroying one weapons depot, the attack would be disproportionate and unlawful. If the attack goes ahead and civilians are killed, prosecutors may argue that a war crime was committed. The generals could later face prosecution in domestic courts or even at the International Criminal Court. This story shows how we use vocabulary like combatant, civilian, distinction, and proportionality, grammar structures like must and must not, and legal phrases like protect civilians or prosecute war crimes. Together, they help lawyers explain complex decisions in clear professional English. Let's take a moment to review today's lesson on international humanitarian law. First, we explored vocabulary that allows you to talk about humanitarian protection. IHL, Geneva Conventions, combatant, civilian, distinction, proportionality, war crimes, genocide, and the International Criminal Court. These terms give you the essential language to describe the rules of war. Second, we practice grammar with modal verbs. Must shows obligations, like civilians must be protected. Must not and cannot show prohibitions, like chemical weapons must not be used. May and can show permissions, like medical staff may cross battle lines. And third, we studied legal phrases: respect IHL, protect civilians, prosecute war crimes, and commit genocide. These expressions allow you to describe real duties and violations in professional English. And fourth, we examined key concepts: customary law, prisoner of war, crimes against humanity, and accountability. These help explain how IHL works in both national and international courts. Finally, we applied everything in a wrap-up story, showing how a lawyer explains whether an attack is lawful, proportionate, or a potential war crime. Now, you can confidently describe IHL rules, obligations, prohibitions, and accountability using clear legal English.